Welcome to SIM-PAC Live. I'm your host, Geoff Matthews, and today we talk to Matt De Jongh, Sustainability Manager for Responsible Wood. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Geoff. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me along.
At each SIM-PAC, we've got a session that's managing natural resources, and I think you've spoken at all 4 SIM-PACs in the last 14 or 16 months. Thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. I've really enjoyed being part of your initiative. It's great. You're the driver. You're the one behind it, and it's been a fantastic platform to be able to be given the opportunity from a forestry perspective to actually promote the ultimate renewable product being timber, which has been great. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it's been awesome to have you. Tell us, firstly, give us a high-level view of what your organisation does.
Thanks, Geoff. So as you said, I work for an organisation known as Responsible Wood. So Responsible Wood is the national governing body for PEFC. So PEFC is the program for the endorsement of forest certification, which is the world's largest forest certification scheme. And Responsible Wood is one of about 50 national governing bodies for PEFC. So Responsible Wood is PEFC for Australia and New Zealand, and Responsible Wood is a forest certification scheme. So we are actually licensed by Standards Australia to write and develop standards, and we write 2 standards, one for sustainable forest management, and that's for forest managers and forest growers, of which we've got about 17 million hectares of forest certified in Australia and New Zealand. We're actually the Southern Hemisphere's largest forest certification scheme. And then we've also got another standard, a chain of custody standard. Again, that's an Australian standard, and that's for the processors, manufacturers, wholesalers and retailers of forest wood-based products. And what chain of custody certification does, it basically traces the forest wood-based product all the way from the forest, all the way through that processing, manufacturing, wholesaling and retailing process. So at the end of the day, that when the consumer purchases a product that's got the responsible wood or the PEFC label on it, whether it be a piece of timber, a piece of cardboard, piece of paper, they can be assured it's come from a forest that's remained a forest, no deforestation has taken place, and also that it's followed a responsible and ethical supply chain as well. So we are a forest and chain of custody certification scheme, if you like, which ensures that forest and wood-based products come from forests that are managed sustainably, that they remain forests, and also that those products follow a responsible and ethical supply chain as well.
Fantastic. Now, look, you used the word when we started. We talked about sustainable forestry, and it's one of the most. It's a natural product. It can be grown and managed very sustainably. Can we talk about the carbon cycle of forests or of timber? The carbon cycle, it starts by these trees organically growing. They are taking carbon out of the atmosphere. They're embedding it for a long period of time, for as long as that timber stays, whatever use you have. And take us through that carbon cycle a little bit more.
You've explained it really well. You've sort of stolen some of my thunder there, which is great. So as we all know, forest wood-based products, they come from trees. And trees are really the ultimate carbon sequestration machine. So trees obviously absorb carbon from the atmosphere. And as you said before, that carbon that's absorbed from the atmosphere, that's actually held within that forest wood-based product for the life of that product. So about half the dry weight of wood, so half the dry weight of timber, is actually what we call biogenic carbon. So that's basically, if you like, a technical term for the name of the carbon that's actually embedded in that forest wood-based product for the life of that product. So, for example, if you've got a 200-kilogram wooden dining room table at your house, like I do and a lot of other people do, about 100 kilos of that wooden dining room table is actually known as biogenic carbon. So for the life of that forest and timber product, you've actually got that biogenic carbon, which is absorbed from the atmosphere, that's actually held in that product for the life of that product. So you should feel very satisfied eating your breakfast, lunch and dinner off that table, because you're actually doing your bit for climate mitigation. So as we all know, trees absorb and sequester carbon. And also a little known fact as well is that young regrowing trees, so after a forest has been harvested and forest and wood-based products have been removed from those trees, young regrowing trees, so certified sustainably managed forests, which is the case for Responsible Wood PEFC, the forest needs to regrow and regenerate. So once trees have been removed, new trees are replanted, they regrow and they regenerate. So young regrowing trees actually absorb more carbon than older trees. So a little bit like people, when they get to a certain age, they get old, they start to decay. Trees actually emit carbon, whereas young regrowing trees actually absorb more carbon than older trees. And That's not only me saying that. That's scientifically proven. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, have made a statement along those lines, which actually says that a sustainably managed forest that's managed for things such as timber production actually has far greater climate mitigation benefits than an unmanaged forest. So a forest that's sustainably managed, where trees are removed, and obviously the biodiversity and the cultural and the social and economic values of that forest are maintained and enhanced. There's all of that, but also the forest actually absorbs more carbon than an unmanaged forest. So I would encourage people to use certified, sustainably managed forest wood-based products, whether it be timber, paper, cardboard, because you're actually supporting the mitigation of climate change by using those products.
Yes, and timber is a product that humans enjoy being around. We do better around it. It even reduces stress levels. But there has been, I suppose, because we had 150 years of deforestation in Australia and New Zealand, and there is a consumer pushback. It got to the point that if you became environmentally conscious, you suddenly got conscious about managing our natural resources. Hence the need for organisations like yourself. Do you find in this day and age that things are getting better for organisations such as yourself, or do you think there's still a sense out there in the public that taking timber is all deforestation still?
Thanks, Jeff. That's a really good question. So that is a common misconception that using forest wood-based products. So, for example, cutting down trees is not always seen as a good thing by people that don't really understand it. So, I guess going back, so an organisation such as Responsible Wood and PEFC, forest certification has been around for 30 years. And forest certification was initially born to halt deforestation. So that's the first premise of certification, is to actually ensure consumers, when they purchase products, forest and wood-based products, as I said before, whether they be timber, paper, cardboard, or whatever, as long as it's got the certification label, so either the Responsible Wood or the PEFC label on it, they can be assured that it is actually deforestation free. So deforestation, what is deforestation? So deforestation is where a forest is cleared for some other permanent land use change. So, for example, where a forest is cleared for, say, urban expansion or for agriculture, for example. Certified sustainable forest management is absolutely not deforestation. So, yeah, sure, trees are cut down, forest wood-based products are removed, but the trees that are removed, they do regrow, they do regenerate. But on top of that, biodiversity, cultural heritage values are also maintained and enhanced. So, for example, under the Responsible Wood Certification Scheme, the forest manager must align themselves with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So that goes over and above the legislation, regulations and codes of practice that govern forestry. They've got to demonstrate that they're treating their workers fairly, that the forests are providing a livelihood for local communities, all of these sorts of things. So, yeah, there is a lot of, unfortunately, misconceptions out there about certification and deforestation. But as I said before, consumers can be absolutely assured, if they purchase certified products, absolutely deforestation free. So unfortunately, only about 10% of the world's forests are certified. So as I said before, certification has been around for about 30 years. And there's a lot of forest out there that's not certified. So really, the only way the consumer can be sure that the products that they're purchasing that are forest wood-based products is deforestation free is that it's certified. And just to go on a point you made there before, Jeff, about working and living in buildings, for example, that are surrounded by timber and forest wood-based products. That's known as, a lot of architects and builders and designers call it biophilic design. So a lot of buildings now are actually built out of timber. So there's a lot of timber buildings out there, and it's been scientifically proven that working and living in buildings that are constructed from timber and working in say an office space that's surrounded by timber, actually those people that work in those environments actually have lower stress levels than people that don't. So a lot of, like, hospitals, schools, universities, for example, are actually using timber in their design process because it's been scientifically proven that it's good for mental health and also reduces stress levels as well. So biophilia or biophilic design, it's all about being in an environment surrounded by nature.
Yes, look, I'm a big fan of wood. I'm a big fan of using wood as a sustainable material, as a carbon sink to embed carbon, and it's a material I love it as a material. Let's address wildlife, and in particular in Australia, koalas. But there are other bird life in Australia. New Zealand has got a different problem. We don't have a lot of our native bird life can't live in an exotic forest. There isn't enough fruit for it. It lives in native forests. So we don't have that particular problem in New Zealand. But take us through that, because from what I've heard you talk about, koalas actually do well in sustainably managed forests.
Yeah, that's correct, Jeff. So just to underscore that, so forest certification, as I said before, not only ensures the trees regrow, they regenerate, but the forest manager needs to demonstrate that biodiversity values are maintained, enhanced, and protected. So biodiversity obviously includes flora and fauna, plants and animals, such as koalas. So an example that I'll use is the New South Wales government for about the last 5 or 7 years has been conducting research on the impacts of native or natural forest harvesting on koalas. And that research is actually shown as publicly available. It's on the New South Wales government website. It's actually shown that koalas are doing really well in a sustainably managed native forest. These are native forests that are certified under the responsible wood standards. Actually found, for example, that there's about 10 times as many koalas as was otherwise anticipated. And the koalas also have a real preference for young regrowing trees as well. So my background is I'm a forester, and I've actually worked in and managed a lot of forests in New South Wales, for example, that have really healthy koala populations. And I've actually seen myself with my own two eyes, the koalas actually have a real preference for a variety of different sizes of trees, so young regrowing trees as well as the older trees. So that's been scientifically proven. That's on the New South Wales government webpage. Not only koalas, there's many other species as well that actually do really well in a certified sustainably managed forest. So using Australia as an example, so for 60,000 plus years, Australia's traditional owners actually use fire, for example, as a friend, not as foe as we do these days. So they introduced fire into the forested landscape. And what that basically did was they did that intentionally because they wanted to clear the trees out of the forest. And they do that temporarily so that the grasses could grow where there once were trees, and the grass will grow where there once was trees, and then that would encourage large animals like kangaroos to come in, and the traditional owners would actually there was actually a form of agriculture known as fire stick farming, so they would actually obviously use the kangaroos as a food source. So for 60,000 plus years, Australia's forests, so both the plants and the animals in those forests, have actually adapted to require some sort of human disturbance as part of their ecology, and particularly fire as well. And that's where, in Australia, the way that certified sustainably managed native forests are managed actually does replicate to a large extent what Australia's traditional owners did for 60,000 plus years. So there's a lot of science that goes into native forest harvesting, and also harvesting of other forests such as plantations as well. So it's very, very scientific, and it's based on best practice management as well.
Talking across Australia and New Zealand, we've got very different native forests. In New Zealand, we've got big podocarp forests. They take enormous time to grow, 500 years for a semi-mature tree. And so we've got to the point where we realise there's no such thing as sustainably harvesting them. We can do deadfall here. But you've got a much shorter growing cycle for your native forests in Australia. That's why you can sustainably harvest them.
Yeah, Jeff, that's a good point. So in Australia, a little known fact is that Australia is actually the 7th most forested country in the world. So Australia has about 134 million hectares of forest, and the vast majority of that, so about 132 million hectares of that, is actually native or natural forests, as I've described. So those are primarily what we know as eucalypt forests, and also acacia species or wattle species. And then we've got about 1.7 million hectares of what we call plantations in Australia as well. So when I talk about plantations, they can be broadly divided up into softwood plantations or pine plantations, and also what we call hardwood plantations. So hardwood plantations, otherwise known as eucalypt plantations as well. So in New Zealand's case, for example, so in New Zealand, it's pretty much all plantations in New Zealand. So that's the area that's available and suitable for commercial forestry. And you have about 1.8 million hectares of plantations in New Zealand, and that's primarily radiata pine or Pinus radiata. So just getting back to the native forests in Australia. So native forests in Australia, so native forests or natural forests. So those are forests that have basically been there forever, pretty much. They've been there for tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. So those forests are generally harvested anywhere between about once every 40 or 80 years, just depending on the ecology and the species that are harvested. Now, as far as our plantations go, so I mentioned softwood plantations or pine plantations. So the majority of the product that's derived from our softwood or our pine plantations in Australia is largely used for house framing, also for timber trusses as well. And they're generally grown for between sort of anywhere between 35 to about 45 years, again, depending on the species. And after they're harvested, they're regrown and regenerated. And then our hardwood plantations, which are basically eucalypt plantations, they're predominantly planted for about 10 or 12 years. And the vast majority of product derived from those is used for like high quality paper. So, for example, photocopy paper, also glossy magazine paper. Some sawlog material is derived from those as well. So high quality hardwood material is also derived from those. And that's when I say high quality hardwood material, I'm talking about things like flooring, decking, also what we call engineered wood products as well. And getting back to the native or natural forests, the vast majority of product that's derived from those is used for high quality hardwood, like as I said before, flooring, decking, and also engineered wood products as well. So engineered wood products, those are forest wood based products that are manufactured in a way that allows them to have similar strength properties to steel and concrete, for example. So they can be used in construction as well.
There's New Zealand companies that are building structural beams for anything from bridges to high-rise buildings because of our earthquake issues. Timber's a lovely material, it flexes, and so we're seeing a lot more of that.
Yeah, that's right, exactly, that's right. And as I said before, there are a lot of examples of timber buildings in Australia. Those buildings are generally comprised of what we call engineered wood products. So there's a lot of products out there. There's a product known as cross-laminated timber, for example. There's many examples, and it's manufactured in a way that gives it similar strength properties to steel and concrete. But unlike other materials that are used in buildings, obviously timber comes from trees. So there's obviously the environmental benefits. There's obviously the climate mitigation benefits of using timber in construction, unlike using other building material, which come from non-renewable resources. And as I said earlier, timber is the ultimate renewable product because it comes from trees. Those trees regrow, they regenerate. And obviously there's a climate mitigation benefits as opposed to using other products that come from non-renewable resources.
I remember talking to an ecologist many years ago when people started recycling paper and to use as written paper. And I remember he was a forest ecologist, and he said, "You've got to give forest owners a reason to grow trees."
Yep.
And the carbon cycle of a recycled piece of paper was going in a container ship to Singapore using fossil fuels and all sorts of things. So It was better to actually grow a tree in New Zealand for 20 years, and give the forest owner an incentive to grow it and make paper, without the bad chemicals in it, which we've moved to. It was a better incentive, and it was a better carbon way. One other point about forestry management before we just move off that. In New Zealand, we've got a problem. You won't have it in Australia, but we've got a problem with forestry slash. And this is particularly with some foreign owners, and it was highlighted by there was a bad flood. They've taken the slashes where they cut all the branches off, falls to the ground, they leave it, they take the good logs off, and then all this forestry slash gets washed down by a flood, takes out everything. It takes out bridges, farmland, roads, whole towns and communities were buried in mud. And people in New Zealand were saying, we've got to do something about this. What does your organisation look at that sort of forestry management and say that that's unacceptable? Where does that fall?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So just to clarify, so at Responsible Wood, as I said earlier, all that we do is we just write and develop standards. So we've got the two standards. So as I said before, one for sustainable forest management. That's for the forest managers and the forest growers, of which we've got about 17 million hectares of forest certified in Australia and New Zealand, I should say. And then we've got the chain of custody standard, which is, as I said before, for the processors, manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers. So we're just a standards development organisation, as I said before, accredited by Standards Australia to do that, and also recognised by Standards New Zealand. And the way the certification works, the certification, if you like, it's audited by independent third-party certification bodies or auditors. So it's those independent third-party auditors or certification bodies. So they're the ones that will look at that example that you've just mentioned before. So they're the ones that would actually have our standard when they go out there and do an audit of those forest managers. And they would basically determine, based on our standards, whether those forest managers are complying with the standards, with the responsible wood standards. And I understand what you're saying, and in some circumstances, obviously there are large rainfall events, but it is really, and obviously that leads to those erosion events that you mentioned before as well. So really is the obligation of the forest manager to, do their due diligence and ensure that they're managing their forest and safeguarding it in a way so that consequences like that don't happen. But that's the role of the certification body or the auditor to actually do that. So just to be clear, responsible wood is completely independent of that auditing process. So that auditing process is done by third-party independent certification bodies or auditors. So it's actually up to them to basically decide whether that forest manager, as the example that you've used, is actually complying with the responsible wood standards. So we absolutely are not involved in that process at all. We're completely independent of that process that's done by independent third-party certification bodies. Or
it was a question I had to address for the New Zealand audience. Also, to recognise here the government's role almost 100 years ago, after the First World War and after the Second World War, we cleared a lot of land that should never have been cleared of native timber, and we put it into farming sheep into grass, which never could sustain grass. And then we planted pines on it, and some of that land is so steep it can't sustain forestry. Yeah. And it needs to go back into native timber is what it does. And that's a problem created that's over a long period of time, And so just acknowledging that. Okay, so when it comes to the forest regeneration post-harvesting, you showed some pictures at SIM-PAC Live Queensland, and I'll put them up, but they showed a forest regrowth from when it's harvested, and it was really quite impressive over a relatively short period span about what a forest looks like when it's regrowing.
Yeah, that's right, Jeff. Yeah, so in Australia and New Zealand, we have very strict legislation, regulations, and codes of practice that govern forestry. So, for example, in Australia, a forest manager who's practicing forestry, just by law, they cannot practice deforestation. They need to ensure that the forest does regrow and regenerate, and that's even before forest certification gets involved. So, as I said before, forest certification goes above that regulation, legislation, and codes of practice, and ensures the forest manager, as I said before, aligns with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Also, what we know is the Montreal Process Criteria and Indicators, which is a whole set of criteria and indicators, which is internationally recognised criteria for the sustainable management of our forests. So just by law, prior to the forest manager harvesting the forest, so in that case, a native or a natural forest, the forest must after it's been harvested, it must go back to what the forest was prior to being harvested. So if there's a mix of species in there, for example, as there often is in a natural or a native forest, then that mix of species must be regrown and regenerated. So, for example, in a native or a natural forest situation in Australia, the forest manager, they will remove a certain number of trees per hectare, for example, and under the codes of practice, they need to retain a certain number of trees per hectare as well. So the trees that are retained, they're retained for either seed dispersal or for habitat as well. So it might be habitat for species, as we talked before, such as koalas, for example, or other other mammals or bird dwelling species as well. So after a forest has been harvested and the trees have been removed and the timber has been taken away, the forest manager usually introduces a light burn into the forest. So the light burn actually removes a fuel load on the forest floor. So fuel load being leaves, branches, bark, that type of thing, and it creates what we call a mineral ash seed bed on the forest floor. And then the smoke from that burn actually induces seed fall in the eucalypt seed pods. So those trees that have been retained for seed dispersal, they actually require smoke. So the smoke from that burn actually induces seed fall. They actually open up their seed pods, and disperse that seed. So that forest naturally regrows and regenerates. As I talked about earlier, that replicates what Australia's traditional owners have done for 60,000 plus years. And so that forest naturally regrows and regenerates. And as I said before, depending on the ecology of that native or natural forest, it might not be another sort of 40 to 80 years until the forest manager comes back and sustainably manages and harvests that forest as well. But prior to any native or natural forest harvesting operation, a lot of surveys done. So a lot of surveying of plants and animals prior to, also during the forest harvesting operation, and that's scientifically based surveys. And so in the New South Wales example, for example, is an organisation known as Forestry Corporation of New South Wales who does that. And then we also have the New South Wales EPA, or the Environment Protection Authority, and they also are like the environmental regulator, if you like, and they also do auditing of that harvesting operation as well. And the forest managers, they generally employ what we call contractors. So contractors are employed to actually do the forest harvesting. And those forest contractors, they have a bit like a driver's license. They have like a forest operator license. They're trained in the in biodiversity management, also in soil and water protection as well. And if they do the wrong thing in a forest harvesting operation, then they're excluded from that forest harvesting area. They might lose their license. They might lose points off their license as well. So it's very highly regulated and legislated, native forest harvesting in both Australia and New Zealand. That's just an example of native forest harvesting in Australia, the Australian context.
So you said something at SIM-PAC Live Queensland in answer to a question. It blew my mind, actually. You said that we've got a $5 billion trade deficit when it comes to timber in Australia. So that means we import $5 billion worth of more of timber than we export or use. Can you take us through the figures? How much do we produce and value and consume? And is there, because we import from overseas, does that mean there's timber going unused in Australia?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, Jeff. So as I said before, we actually are the seventh most forested country in the world. So we have a lot of forests, we have a lot of timber, but unfortunately, we do import a lot of timber from overseas. So you're right, we do have about a $5 billion trade deficit. So what we do in Australia here is we export a lot of raw material overseas, for example. So when I say raw material, things like round logs, for example. So we import it overseas, and then we buy it back as value added furniture, for example. So we export a lot of raw logs overseas, and we buy it back as value added timber. But we also do import a lot of forest wood based products from overseas, unfortunately. And it's the trade deficit at the moment is about $5 billion. So we certainly have enough resource here in Australia. However, we just don't produce enough of our product here in Australia from the resource that we have made available to be able to supply domestic demand, because we have a very strong demand for forest wood based products in Australia. So, for example, Australian hardwoods are very highly sought after in Australia. I think Australian hardwoods have got a really good reputation internationally as well. But yeah, unfortunately, the area of forest that's available for timber harvesting, for example, is not of the size to allow us to just use our domestic resources. We have to import timber from overseas. So I suppose just on that, as long as importers are purchasing timber from overseas that's been certified, so for example, as long as it's certified to, if it's coming from overseas, it'll be certified to PEFC, so the Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification. As long as it's certified to PEFC, that importer can be assured that it's come from a sustainably managed source. We also work very closely with the Australian government. So, for example, the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry on their illegal logging laws. So under the Australian government illegal logging laws, forest certification in the form of responsible wood and PEFC is recognised under that framework. So if importers are importing timber, as long as it's certified, but they've also got to do additional due diligence as well to ensure that it's come from a sustainable source and hasn't been illegally logged.
And I assume that's policed by the Australian government in some form?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so the Australian government has its own compliance team that polices that. And as I said before, we work very closely with the Australian government. I've just come off a workshop this morning where we had a workshop with a whole bunch of our certified organisations and the Australian government, just providing information on the updated information on Australia's illegal logging legislation.
Great. Look, Matt, thank you very much. Thank you for this discussion. It's been great. Well done to your organisation. We appreciate you being there. For consumers, you give them a guarantee that something has been managed to the best available standards that we have in front of us today.
Yep.
And I assume that you guys are updating those standards, constantly as new tech and new understanding comes forward, and to be able to have the assurance to safely go and buy things.
Yep.
And that's because I think we should be using more timber, and we should be speccing more timber, and our architects and our building designers, and even in our own home. And we need those assurances from organisations such as yours to give the consumer the assurity that they have done the right thing.
Yeah, that's right, Jeff. No, exactly. I couldn't have summed it up better myself. But I suppose the takeaway message is that when consumers purchase products, as long as it's responsible wood or PEFC certified, they can be assured it's come from a forest that's remain a forest. There's no deforestation. I would really encourage people to use products that are responsible wood or PEFC certified, because they're actually doing a good thing for the environment by purchasing those products. Because by purchasing those products, you're allowing for those forest managers and forest growers out there to continually replant and regrow those trees, which obviously reduces carbon in the atmosphere. So it's got really positive outcomes for not only the climate, but also there's also those social and economic benefits as well. So it's absolutely the right thing to do to use certified, sustainably managed products. But thank you, Jeff. Thanks for the opportunity, and I really want to thank you for the great job that you're doing to help bring this to everyone's attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Jeff.